the picture to some pretty irrelevance of detail. Mrs. Gisburn presenting a neutral surface to work on, forming as it were so inevitably the background of her own picture, had lent herself in an unusual degree to the display of this false virtuosity. The picture was one of Jack's strongest, as his admirers would have put it. It represented on his part a swelling of muscles, a congesting of veins, a balancing, straddling, and straining that reminded one of the circus clown's ironic efforts to lift a feather. It met, in short, at every point, the demand of lovely woman to be painted strongly because she was tired of being painted sweetly, and yet not to lose an atom of the sweetness. "It's the last he painted, you know," Mrs. Gisburn said with pardonable pride. "The last but one," she corrected herself. "But the other doesn't count because he destroyed it." Destroyed it? I was about to follow up this clue when I heard a footstep and saw Jack himself on the threshold. As he stood there, his hands in the pockets of his velveteen coat, the thin brown waves of hair pushed back from his white forehead, his lean sunburnt cheeks furrowed by a smile that lifted the tips of a self-confident mustache, I felt to what a degree he had the same quality as his pictures, the quality of looking cleverer than he was. His wife glanced at him deprecatingly, but his eyes traveled past her to the portrait. "Mr. Rickham wanted to see it," she began, as if excusing herself. He shrugged his shoulders, still smiling. "Oh, Rickham found me out long ago," he said lightly. Then passing his arm through mine, "Come and see the rest of the house." He showed it to me with a kind of naive suburban pride, the bathrooms, the speaking tubes, the dress closets, the trouser presses, all the complex simplifications of the millionaire's domestic economy. And whenever my wonder paid the expected tribute, he said, throwing out his chest a little, "Yes, I really don't see how people manage to live without that." Well, it was just the end one might have foreseen for him, only he was, through it all, and in spite of it all, as he had been through, and in spite of, his pictures, so handsome, so charming, so disarming, that one longed to cry out, "Be dissatisfied with your leisure," as one had longed to say, "Be dissatisfied with your work." But with the cry on my lips, my diagnosis suffered an unexpected check. "This is my own lair," he said, leading me into a dark, plain room at the end of the florid vista. It was square and brown and leathery, no effects, no bric-a-brac, none of the air of posing for reproduction in a picture weekly. Above all, no least sign of ever having been used as a studio. The fact brought home to me the absolute finality of Jack's break with his old life. "Don't ever dabble with paint any more?" I asked, still looking about for a trace of such activity. "Never," he said briefly. "Or watercolor or etching?" His confident eyes grew dim, and his cheeks paled a little under their handsome sunburn. "Never think of it, my dear fellow, any more than if I'd never touched a brush." And his tone told me in a flash that he never thought of anything else. I moved away, instinctively embarrassed by my unexpected discovery. And as I turned, my eye fell on a small picture above the mantelpiece, the only object breaking the plain oak paneling of the room. "Ha, by Jove!" I said. It was a sketch of a donkey, an old, tired donkey, standing in the rain under a wall. "By Jove! A Stroud!" I cried. He was silent, but I felt him close behind me, breathing a little quickly. "What a wonder! Made with a dozen lines, but on everlasting foundations, you lucky chap! Where did you get it?" He answered slowly, "Mrs. Stroud gave it to me." "Oh, I didn't know you even knew the Strouds." He was such an inflexible hermit. "I didn't. till after. She sent for me to paint him when he was dead." "When he was dead? Hugh?" I must have let a little too much amazement escape through my surprise, for he answered with a deprecating laugh. "Yes, she's an awful simpleton, you know, Mrs. Stroud. Her only idea was to have him done by a fashionable painter. Ah, poor Stroud! She thought it was the surest way of proclaiming his greatness, of forcing it on a pure blind public. And at the moment I was the fashionable painter." "Ah, poor Stroud, as you say. Was that his history?" "That was his history. She believed in him, gloried in him, or thought she did. But she couldn't bear not to have all the drawing rooms with her. She couldn't bear the fact that on varnishing days one could always get near enough to see his pictures. Poor woman! She's just a fragment groping for other fragments. Stroud is the only whole I ever knew." "You ever knew? But you just said—" Gisburn had a curious smile in his eyes. "Oh, I knew him, and he knew me, only it happened after he was dead." I dropped my voice instinctively. "When she sent for you?" "Yes, quite insensible to the irony. She wanted him vindicated, and by me." He laughed again and threw his head back to look up at the sketch of the donkey. "There were days when I couldn't look at that thing, couldn't face it. But I forced myself to put it here, and now it's cured me. Cured me! That's the reason why I don't dabble any more, my dear Rickham. Or rather, Stroud himself is the reason." For the first time my idle curiosity about my companion turned into a serious desire to understand him better. "I wish you'd tell me how it happened," I said. He stood looking up at the sketch and twirling between his fingers a cigarette he had forgotten to light. Suddenly he turned toward me. "I'd rather like to tell you, because I've always suspected you of loathing my work." I made a deprecating gesture, which he negatived with a good-humored shrug. "Oh, I didn't care a straw when I believed in myself, and now it's an added tie between us." He laughed slightly, without bitterness, and pushed one of the deep arm-chairs forward. "There, make yourself comfortable, and here are the cigars you like." He placed them at my elbow and continued to wander up and down the room, stopping now and then beneath the picture. "How it happened, I can tell you in 5 minutes, and it didn't take much longer to happen. I can remember now how surprised and pleased I was when I got Mrs. Stroud's note. Of course, deep down, I had always felt there was no one like him, only I'd gone with the stream, echoed the usual platitudes about him, till I half got to think he was a failure, one of the kind that are left behind. By Jove, and he was left behind, because he had come to stay. The rest of us had to let ourselves be swept along or go under, but he was high above the current, on everlasting foundations, as you say. Well, I went off to the house in my most egregious mood, rather moved, Lord forgive me, at the pathos of poor Stroud's career of failure being crowned by the glory of my painting him. Of course I meant to do the picture for nothing. I told Mrs. Stroud so when she began to stammer something about her poverty. I remember getting off a prodigious phrase about the honor being mine. Oh, I was princely, my dear Rickham. I was posing to myself like one of my own sitters. Then I was taken up and left alone with him. I had sent all my traps in advance, and I had only to set up the easel and get to work. He'd been dead only 24 hours, and he died suddenly of heart disease, so that there had been no preliminary work of destruction. His face was clear and untouched. I had met him once or twice, years before, and thought him insignificant and dingy. Now I saw that he was superb. I was glad at first, with a merely aesthetic satisfaction, glad to have my hand on such a subject. Then his strange life-likeness began to affect me queerly. As I blocked the head in, I felt as if he were watching me do it. The sensation was followed by the thought, if he were watching me, what would he say to my way of working? My strokes began to go a little wild. I felt